My name is Jennifer Walsh, and I'm a cognitive neuroscientist with 12 years of experience studying how the human brain develops learning patterns. I spent most of my career believing that our education system, while flawed, was fundamentally designed to help children learn and grow. 4 months ago, something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew about the true purpose of schooling in America. It started when I was analyzing brain scans of children from different educational backgrounds for a study on learning retention. What I discovered in those neural patterns didn't match anything we were supposed to see. The children who'd been in traditional schools the longest showed something that made my blood run cold. Their brains had been systematically rewired to suppress curiosity and independent thinking. And if you think you know where this is going, trust me, you don't. Because what I found buried in archived government documents from the 1800s changed my understanding of education forever. And it explains why so many of us feel like something is fundamentally wrong with how we're preparing our children for the world. It began in March when I was analyzing fMRI data from a longitudinal study tracking cognitive development in children aged 6 to 16. We were comparing kids from traditional public schools, homeschool children, and students from alternative educational models like Sudbury schools. The traditional school children showed a disturbing pattern. In areas of the brain associated with curiosity, creative problem-solving, and independent decision-making, there was significantly reduced activity compared to children educated outside the system. But here's what really got my attention. This reduction wasn't random. It was systematic, progressive, and it correlated directly with the number of years spent in traditional schooling. My professional instincts screamed that something was off. In 12 years of studying brain development, I'd never seen such consistent suppression of natural learning mechanisms. These children's brains were being trained, almost like conditioning, to respond to external authority rather than internal motivation. I started digging deeper. I reached out to colleagues, cross-referenced studies from other countries, and what I found made me physically sick. The pattern wasn't unique to America. It was present in every country that had adopted the Prussian model of education, which forms the backbone of virtually every modern school system. That's when I decided to research the historical origins of our education system. And what I discovered in the archives of the Smithsonian Institution changed everything I believed about the purpose of schooling. The modern education system wasn't designed to educate. It was designed to create compliant workers and obedient citizens. The evidence was right there in black and white, in the writings of the men who created it. Johann Fichte, one of the fathers of state schooling, explicitly argued that schools should create a cohesive and compliant citizenry who would submit to the nation and the virtues of the state. This wasn't education. This was social engineering on a massive scale. But it gets worse. I found a document from Harvard University's Alexander Inglis from the 1920s that outlined 6 basic functions of state schooling. Let me read you the exact wording, because it's chilling. First, the adaptive function, establishing fixed habits of reflexive obedience to arbitrary authority. Second, the conformity function, producing compliant, predictable, and easily controllable masses. Third, the diagnostic function, determining each student's proper role in society based on their academic record. My hands literally trembled as I read this. These weren't the words of some fringe conspiracy theorist. This was official educational policy from one of America's most prestigious universities, and it was designed to sort children into predetermined social roles while crushing their natural independence. But here's where it gets really disturbing. This system is still working exactly as intended, and I found the proof in recent government data that most people never see. In March 2023, the National Assessment of Educational Progress released data showing that reading scores for 13-year-olds had dropped to their lowest levels since 2003, while math scores hit their lowest point since 1990. But here's what they didn't tell you. This wasn't academic failure. This was system success. I analyzed the standardized testing data alongside my brain scan research, and the correlation was undeniable. The areas where test scores were dropping the most corresponded exactly to the brain regions associated with independent thinking and creative problem-solving. The system was working perfectly. It was successfully suppressing the exact cognitive abilities that would make students question authority. Then I discovered something that made me question my own sanity. I found internal memos from the Department of Education dating back to 2002, when No Child Left Behind was implemented. The documents explicitly discussed behavioral modification objectives and compliance metrics, not learning outcomes, but obedience measurements. One memo, marked internal distribution only, outlined how standardized testing could be used to identify and redirect nonconforming thought patterns in student populations. They weren't measuring what kids learned. They were measuring how successfully the system had programmed them to give predetermined responses. What I discovered next explained exactly how this programming works at the neurological level, and it's more sophisticated than anything I could have imagined. The human brain develops most of its neural pathways between ages 5 and 18, exactly the years children spend in traditional schooling. During this critical period, the brain is essentially being wired for how it will function for the rest of that person's life. Traditional schools create what neuroscientists call learned helplessness pathways. Through constant external validation, grades, bells, permission slips, hall passes, children's brains literally rewire themselves to seek approval from authority figures rather than trust their own judgment. The constant interruptions every 45 minutes train the brain to have a shortened attention span and to require external stimulation to stay focused. But here's the most disturbing part. I found evidence that this rewiring is intentional. In 1996, the Pentagon funded a study called Project MindBridge that specifically researched how classroom environments could be optimized to create responsive civilian populations. The study concluded that traditional classroom management techniques were highly effective at suppressing autonomous decision-making capabilities. When I started comparing education systems internationally, the pattern became even clearer. Countries with the highest levels of standardized testing and rigid curriculum control also showed the highest levels of political compliance and the lowest rates of social unrest. Meanwhile, countries like Finland, which abandoned standardized testing and gave students more autonomy, saw increases in both academic performance and what researchers call civic skepticism, citizens' willingness to question government policies. I discovered that in 2022, when Finland eliminated most standardized tests for children under 13, there was an immediate 10% increase in scores measuring independent problem solving and creative reasoning. But here's what's interesting. At the exact same time, the United States increased standardized testing requirements in response to post-pandemic learning loss. The contrast couldn't be more clear. While other countries were moving toward educational freedom, America was doubling down on the control mechanisms that had been designed in the 1800s to create obedient factory workers. That's when I decided to study children from alternative educational environments, homeschoolers, unschoolers, and students from Sudbury schools, to see if my hypothesis was correct. The results were extraordinary. Children educated outside the traditional system showed brain patterns similar to those of highly successful entrepreneurs, artists, and innovators. Their neural pathways were optimized for independent thinking, creative problem solving, and self-motivation, exactly the opposite of what traditional schooling produces. A 2004 study of 119 alumni from Sudbury Valley School, where students have complete freedom to learn what they want, found that over 80% went on to higher education, but more importantly, they showed what researchers called exceptional autonomy and resistance to social conformity. These students had never been trained to seek external validation. They trusted their own judgment, pursued their genuine interests, and couldn't be easily manipulated by authority figures. In other words, they were everything the traditional education system was designed to prevent children from becoming. Now here's where this gets personal, and where I realized the true scope of what we're dealing with. After I published my preliminary findings in a peer-reviewed journal, strange things started happening. My research funding was suddenly redirected to other projects. Conferences stopped inviting me to speak. Colleagues who had been supportive began avoiding my calls. Then, in September 2024, I received what appeared to be a routine survey from the National Science Foundation asking about my current research priorities and whether I plan to continue studying alternative educational methodologies. The timing felt too coincidental. But here's what really convinced me that I'd stumbled onto something significant. I started getting contacted by other researchers who'd noticed similar patterns. A developmental psychologist from Stanford told me her funding had been cut after she published data showing that homeschooled children had abnormally high levels of independent thinking. A neurologist from Johns Hopkins said his study on the effects of standardized testing on brain development had been indefinitely postponed by his department. We weren't just individual researchers noticing coincidences. We were part of a pattern of systematic suppression of research that threatens the fundamental assumptions about education in America. Think about your own education experience for a moment. Do you remember being excited about learning when you first started school? Do you remember when that excitement started to fade? Most adults I talked to described the same progression. Initial curiosity that gradually died as they learned to focus more on grades than understanding, more on following directions than asking questions. They learned that the right answer was whatever the teacher wanted to hear, not what they actually thought or observed. This isn't accidental learning loss. This is successful behavioral modification. The system took naturally curious, creative children and systematically trained them to suppress their instincts in favor of external authority. And we call this education. But here's what gives me hope. More parents are starting to notice. Homeschooling rates have skyrocketed since 2020. Alternative schools are opening across the country. There's a growing recognition that something is fundamentally wrong with forcing all children through the same industrial process, regardless of their individual needs or interests. The question is, now that you know this, what are you going to do about it? Have you noticed these patterns in your own children or in yourself? Have you ever wondered why so many creative, curious kids become passive, compliant adults? And if our education system was really designed to create independent thinkers, why does it work so hard to eliminate every trace of independence and original thought? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've had experiences with alternative education, whether as a student, parent, or teacher, please share your story. Because the more we talk about this openly, the harder it becomes for anyone to maintain the illusion that our current system is about education rather than control. The evidence is overwhelming, and it's hiding in plain sight. The only question is whether we're brave enough to see it for what it really is, and whether we're willing to do something about it before we lose another generation of naturally brilliant, curious human beings to a system designed to create obedient followers instead of independent thinkers.